Sarah Martinez stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed no more than 110 pounds, soaking wet. At 22 years old, she looked more like someone who belonged in a college library than on a military training ground. Her fellow recruits at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island, towered over her, their broad shoulders and muscular frames making her appear fragile in comparison. The morning sun blazed down on the training field as Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Williams barked orders at the fresh batch of recruits. Sarah adjusted her oversized helmet, which seemed to swallow her small head, and gripped her rifle with sweaty palms. Around her, the other recruits looked confident and ready. She could feel their sideways glances and hear their whispered comments. "Look at Tiny Martinez," muttered Private Johnson, a massive man from Texas who stood 6'4". "She's gonna break in half during the first exercise." Private Coleman, a former college football player, chuckled quietly. "My little sister is bigger than her. What's she even doing here?" Sarah pretended not to hear them, but each comment stung like a physical blow. She had dreamed of becoming a Marine since childhood, inspired by her grandfather who had served in Vietnam. Her family had tried to talk her out of it, suggesting she pursue nursing or teaching instead. Even the recruiter had seemed surprised when she walked into his office, asking if she was sure she wanted to join the Marines and not the Air Force. But Sarah had trained relentlessly for this moment. She woke up at 4 every morning for 2 years, running miles through her neighborhood while everyone else slept. She lifted weights at the local gym, practiced martial arts, and studied military tactics until her eyes burned. She knew she was ready, even if no one else believed it. Drill Instructor Williams approached their formation, his steel-gray eyes scanning each recruit like a predator, sizing up prey. When his gaze fell on Sarah, his expression shifted to one of barely concealed disappointment. "Martinez!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the humid South Carolina air. "Step forward!" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribcage as she took 3 precise steps forward and stood at attention. The other recruits remained motionless, but she could feel their anticipation hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. "Recruits," Williams announced to the group, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "This is what happens when the military lowers its standards. We get people who think they can play soldier but can't handle real combat." Heat rushed to Sarah's cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral and her eyes fixed straight ahead. Years of preparation had taught her to control her emotions, even when people tried to break her down. Williams circled around her like a shark. "You think you belong here, Martinez? You think you can keep up with real Marines?" "Sir, yes, sir," Sarah responded with crisp authority. "We'll see about that," Williams said with a cold smile. "Today we start combat training, hand-to-hand combat, obstacle courses, and endurance tests. Let's see if you last the morning." The first exercise was a simple obstacle course that included rope climbing, wall scaling, and crawling under barbed wire. Sarah watched as the other recruits attacked the course with brute force, using their size and strength to power through each challenge. When her turn came, she took a different approach. Instead of trying to muscle her way up the rope, she used a technique she had learned in rock climbing, wrapping her legs efficiently and pulling herself up with smooth, controlled movements. While the bigger recruits huffed and panted, Sarah moved with fluid grace, conserving energy and maintaining perfect form. But Williams wasn't impressed. "Too slow, Martinez. In combat, speed saves lives." The wall scaling proved more challenging for someone of her height, but Sarah had anticipated this. She had practiced for months on similar obstacles, learning to use momentum and technique rather than raw power. She ran at the wall, planted one foot halfway up, and used her forward motion to reach the top edge. Her fingers locked onto the wood, and she pulled herself over in one smooth motion. "Lucky," muttered Private Stevens, another recruit who had struggled with the same wall, despite being nearly twice her size. The crawling exercise under barbed wire was where Sarah truly began to show her advantages. While the larger recruits had to squeeze their bulk through the tight space, scraping their backs and getting caught on the wire, Sarah slipped through like water. Her small frame allowed her to move quickly and efficiently, completing the section faster than anyone else. Williams frowned but said nothing. The other recruits exchanged glances, some beginning to look at her with grudging respect, others with increased resentment. The afternoon brought weapons training. Sarah had expected this to be her biggest challenge. The M16 rifle felt heavy in her small hands, and she struggled to hold it steady during the initial instruction. The other recruits snickered as she adjusted her stance multiple times, trying to find a comfortable shooting position. "Martinez can't even hold the weapon properly," Johnson whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How's she gonna handle the recoil?" When they moved to the firing range, Sarah's hands shook slightly as she loaded her first magazine. She had fired weapons before during her preparation, but never under this kind of pressure, with dozens of eyes watching her every move and waiting for her to fail. Williams appeared behind her. "Remember, Martinez, in combat, every shot counts. Miss your target and you're dead. Miss your target, and your fellow Marines are dead." Sarah nodded and settled into her firing position. She controlled her breathing just as she had practiced hundreds of times at the civilian range back home. The first shot rang out, and she felt the rifle kick against her shoulder. Through the scope, she could see she had hit the outer ring of the target. "Pathetic," Williams declared. "Again!" Shot after shot, Sarah focused on her breathing, her grip, her stance. Gradually, her shots moved closer to the center. By the end of the session, she was hitting the target consistently, though not with the accuracy she knew she was capable of. That evening in the barracks, the other recruits gathered around their bunks, sharing stories and bonding over their shared experiences. Sarah sat alone on her bunk, cleaning her rifle and reviewing the day's lessons in her head. She could hear their conversations, and her name came up more than once. "I give her a week," said Coleman. "Maybe 2 if she's lucky." "The instructors are just waiting for an excuse to wash her out," added Stevens. "Did you see how Williams was looking at her? He wants her gone." Private Anderson, a quiet recruit from Oregon, glanced over at Sarah. "I don't know. Did you guys see how fast she went through that crawling exercise? And she didn't give up on the shooting range?" "Beginner's luck," Johnson dismissed. "Wait until we get to real combat training. She'll fold like paper." Sarah continued cleaning her rifle, each word cutting deep but also fueling her determination. She had faced doubt and dismissal her entire life. Teachers who thought she was too small for sports, coaches who refused to give her a chance, family members who suggested she pursue more appropriate careers. But each time someone told her she couldn't do something, it only made her more determined to prove them wrong. Late that night, after lights out, Sarah lay on her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. Through the darkness, she could hear the steady breathing of sleeping recruits around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for her to fail in front of everyone. But it would also bring new opportunities to show them what she was truly capable of. She thought about her grandfather, who had shared stories of his time in Vietnam. He had been small too, not much bigger than Sarah herself, but he had earned respect through his actions, not his size. He had saved 3 fellow soldiers from an enemy ambush, carrying them to safety one by one despite being wounded himself. "It's not about being the biggest or the strongest," he had told her before she left for boot camp. "It's about having the heart of a warrior and the will to never give up. Size doesn't matter when you have something worth fighting for." Sarah closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself and to her grandfather's memory. She would not quit. She would not give up. No matter what Williams threw at her, no matter how many recruits doubted her, she would prove that she belonged here. She would show them that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. The next morning came too soon, with Williams's voice cutting through their sleep like a blade. As Sarah jumped out of her bunk and began the familiar routine of getting dressed and making her bed, she noticed something different in the way some of the other recruits looked at her. The mockery was still there, but underneath it was a hint of uncertainty. They had expected her to break on the first day, to wash out before the real training even began. But she was still here, still standing, still ready for whatever came next. And that small fact was beginning to plant seeds of doubt in their minds about just who Sarah Martinez really was and what she might be capable of. Williams had promised that today would bring hand-to-hand combat training. Sarah knew this would be her greatest test yet. Fighting opponents who outweighed her by 50 to 100 pounds seemed impossible. But she had spent years studying martial arts specifically for this moment, learning techniques that allowed smaller fighters to overcome larger opponents. As they marched to the training area, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was what she had trained for her entire life. This was her chance to show them that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. The hand-to-hand combat training area was a large rectangular space covered with thick mats. 20 recruits stood in formation, all eyes on drill instructor Williams as he explained the basic principles of Marine Corps martial arts. Sarah stood at the end of the line, her small frame barely visible among the much larger recruits. "Listen up," Williams barked, pacing in front of them like a caged predator. "In real combat, your weapon might jam, run out of ammunition, or get knocked away. When that happens, your body becomes your weapon. Today, you learn whether you have what it takes to survive close-quarters combat." He stopped directly in front of Private Johnson, the massive Texan who had been most vocal about Sarah's supposed weakness. "Johnson, you're up first. Show these recruits how it's done." Johnson stepped forward with confidence, his muscles bulging under his uniform. At 6'4" and 230 pounds, he looked like he could wrestle bears for entertainment. Williams paired him with Private Foster, another large recruit from Alabama, who stood nearly as tall. The two giants circled each other on the mat, both trying to use their size advantage to overpower the other. Johnson eventually won by wrapping Foster in a bear hug and throwing him to the ground, using pure strength to dominate his opponent. Williams nodded approvingly. "That's what real Marines look like in combat: power, aggression, dominance." One by one, the larger recruits took their turns, each trying to impress Williams with displays of raw force. They grunted and strained against each other, muscles straining as they attempted to prove their physical superiority. Some fights were close, others ended quickly, but all followed the same pattern of bigger and stronger usually winning. Finally, Williams's cold eyes settled on Sarah. "Martinez, you're up." A collective silence fell over the group. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She had been dreading this moment and preparing for it simultaneously. "Who should we pair her with?" Williams asked the group with mock thoughtfulness. "Someone her own size would be fair, but we don't have any children here." The other recruits snickered nervously. They wanted to see Sarah fail, but some part of them also felt uncomfortable about watching a much larger man potentially hurt someone so much smaller. "I'll take her," Johnson volunteered, stepping forward with a cruel grin. "Someone needs to show her this isn't a game." Williams smiled coldly. "Excellent. Johnson versus Martinez. Let's see what happens when fantasy meets reality." Sarah walked onto the mat, feeling like a mouse entering a lion's den. Johnson followed, cracking his knuckles and rolling his massive shoulders. The size difference was almost comical. Sarah's head barely reached Johnson's chest, and he outweighed her by more than 100 pounds. "You sure you want to do this, little girl?" Johnson asked in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't want to hurt you too bad." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she focused on her breathing and centered herself, just as her martial arts instructors had taught her. She had spent years learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, and Krav Maga specifically because these disciplines were designed for smaller practitioners to defeat larger opponents. But knowing the techniques and applying them under pressure against someone Johnson's size were two very different things. Williams blew his whistle, and Johnson immediately rushed forward, confident he could end the fight quickly with his overwhelming size advantage. This was exactly what Sarah had expected. Larger opponents almost always tried to use their strength first, believing it would be enough. As Johnson reached for her with his massive arms, Sarah dropped low and spun to his side, avoiding his grasp entirely. Johnson stumbled forward, confused by her sudden disappearance from in front of him. By the time he turned around, Sarah had positioned herself perfectly. Using a technique from judo, Sarah grabbed Johnson's uniform and used his own momentum against him. As he tried to turn and face her, she pulled him forward while sweeping his leg. Johnson, all 230 pounds of him, crashed to the mat with a thunderous impact that seemed to shake the entire training area. The watching recruits gasped in shock. Johnson scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Lucky shot," he growled. "Won't happen again." But Sarah had already read his body language and knew exactly what he would do next. Angry opponents became predictable opponents. Johnson charged again, this time trying to tackle her to the ground where he could use his weight advantage. Sarah waited until the last possible second, then sidestepped like a matador, avoiding a charging bull. As Johnson flew past her, she grabbed his arm and used his own force to send him rolling across the mat. This time, he hit the ground even harder. Williams stopped pacing and stared at the action with intense interest. This was not going according to his expectations. Around the mat, the other recruits watched in stunned silence as their seemingly weakest member systematically dismantled their strongest. Johnson got up more slowly this time, breathing hard and completely frustrated. He had expected to overpower Sarah within seconds, and instead found himself on the ground twice while she hadn't even been touched. "Stand still and fight like a man," he shouted, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "I'm not a man," Sarah replied calmly, speaking for the first time since stepping onto the mat. "I'm a Marine." This response seemed to infuriate Johnson even more. He rushed at her again, but this time Sarah didn't just avoid his attack. As he reached for her, she grabbed his wrist with both hands and dropped to her back, placing her foot against his hip. Using a technique called a sacrifice throw, she used his own weight and momentum to launch him over her head. Johnson flew through the air and landed hard on his back, the impact knocking the wind out of him completely. He lay on the mat, gasping for breath, unable to get up immediately. The training area was completely silent except for Johnson's labored breathing. Sarah rolled to her feet and stood waiting, not celebrating or gloating, just ready for whatever came next. Williams walked onto the mat and looked down at Johnson, who was still struggling to catch his breath. "Get up, Private. This fight isn't over until I say it's over." Johnson slowly pulled himself to his feet, but the fight had gone out of him. His confidence was shattered, and he looked at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and fear. How could someone so small make him look so helpless? "Again," Williams commanded. This time, Johnson approached more cautiously. He had learned that rushing at Sarah was a mistake, so he tried to grab her more carefully. But Sarah had been training for years against opponents just like him. Every move he made she had seen before and knew how to counter. When Johnson reached for her shoulders, Sarah ducked under his arms and grabbed him around the waist. Using a wrestling technique, she lifted him slightly off balance and then swept his legs, sending him crashing down once again. By now, Johnson was exhausted and demoralized. Each time he tried to use his strength against Sarah, she turned it into a weakness. Each time he thought he had her figured out, she showed him a new technique he had never seen before. Williams watched for a few more exchanges, each one ending the same way, with Johnson on the ground and Sarah standing over him, waiting patiently for the next round. Finally, he blew his whistle. "That's enough," he announced. "Johnson, report to medical to get checked out. You look like you've been hit by a truck." Johnson limped off the mat, his pride as damaged as his body. The other recruits stepped aside to let him pass, many of them looking at him with shock and disappointment. Their invincible giant had been taken apart piece by someone they had dismissed as weak. Williams turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Interesting technique, Martinez. Where did you learn to fight like that?" "I trained for 4 years before enlisting, sir," Sarah replied, still standing at attention. "Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, and Krav Maga." Williams nodded slowly. He was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated this recruit. "And why didn't you mention this during processing?" "Nobody asked, sir." A few of the recruits exchanged glances. Sarah had never bragged about her training or mentioned her martial arts background. She had simply endured their mockery and waited for the right moment to show them who she really was. Williams gestured to the next largest recruit in line. "Stevens, you're up. Let's see if you can do better than Johnson." Private Stevens, the college football player, stepped onto the mat with considerably less confidence than Johnson had shown. He had just watched Sarah systematically destroy someone much larger than himself, and he knew he was in for a real fight. Stevens tried a different approach, attempting to use his wrestling background to control the pace of the fight. But Sarah had trained with wrestlers before and knew their strengths and weaknesses intimately. When Stevens shot in for a takedown, Sarah sprawled and caught him in a chokehold. Within 30 seconds, Stevens was tapping out, gasping for air. Williams called for the next recruit, and then the next. Private Coleman tried to use his boxing skills, but found himself on the ground within minutes. Private Anderson attempted to keep his distance and strike from range, but Sarah closed the distance and took him down before he could land a significant blow. One by one, Sarah defeated every challenger Williams put in front of her. Some lasted longer than others, but the outcome was always the same. The recruit everyone had dismissed as too weak for Marine training was systematically proving that she was more skilled in combat than any of them. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the training area completely changed. The mockery and whispered comments about Sarah's size disappeared, replaced by nervous respect and growing fear. These recruits had all considered themselves tough, but none of them could last more than a few minutes against someone half their size. Williams watched each fight with increasing interest. This was not just beginner's luck or a few successful techniques. Sarah was demonstrating a level of martial arts skill that exceeded anything he had seen from new recruits. Her movements were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. Finally, Williams had seen enough. "That's sufficient for today," he announced. "Martinez, remain behind. The rest of you return to barracks." As the other recruits filed out, many of them nursing bruises and wounded pride, Sarah remained standing at attention in the center of the mat. She had proven her point, but she wasn't sure what consequences might follow. Williams approached her, his expression serious but no longer dismissive. "Martinez, in 20 years of training Marines, I have never seen a display like that. You just defeated 8 men, each one bigger and supposedly stronger than you." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond. "Tomorrow we move on to weapons training and tactical exercises," Williams continued. "I have a feeling we haven't seen everything you're capable of yet." As Sarah walked back to the barracks, she could feel the stares of the other recruits following her. The dynamic had completely shifted. She was no longer the weak link they needed to worry about. She had become something much more dangerous, an unknown quantity whose true capabilities were just beginning to be revealed. The morning of the final evaluation dawned gray and misty. After 3 weeks of intense training, only 18 of the original 20 recruits remained. 2 had washed out after failing to meet the physical and mental demands of Marine Corps training. Sarah Martinez was not only still standing, but had quietly become one of the most feared recruits in the entire company. Word of her performance in hand-to-hand combat had spread throughout the base. Drill instructors from other units had started showing up to watch her training sessions, curious to see the recruit who had taken down every challenger put in front of her. But Sarah remained focused on her goal, earning the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor that would make her a United States Marine. Staff Sergeant Williams gathered the remaining recruits in the pre-dawn darkness for their final test. This wouldn't be individual combat or obstacle courses. Instead, they would face a complex tactical scenario that would test everything they had learned during training. "Recruits," Williams announced, his breath visible in the cool morning air, "today you face your final challenge. You will be divided into 2 teams for a combat simulation exercise. One team will defend a strategic position, while the other attempts to take it. Success will be measured not just on physical performance, but on tactics, teamwork, and leadership under pressure." Sarah listened carefully as Williams explained the rules of engagement. They would be using training weapons that fired paint rounds, and each recruit would wear sensors that would register hits. The defending team would have the advantage of prepared positions, while the attacking team would have the element of surprise and mobility. Williams began dividing the recruits into teams. To Sarah's surprise, she found herself grouped with 4 of the largest and most athletic recruits, including Johnson and Stevens, 2 of the men she had defeated in hand-to-hand combat. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now expected to work alongside people who had once mocked her as too weak for military service. "Red team will defend the communications bunker," Williams announced. "Blue team will attempt to capture it. You have 1 hour to prepare your positions or plan your assault. The exercise begins at 800 hours. Sarah's team, designated as Blue Team, was tasked with the assault. As they huddled together to plan their attack, Johnson looked uncomfortable about taking tactical advice from someone he had once dismissed as helpless. But his attitude had changed significantly since their encounter on the training mat. "So what's the plan?" asked Private Coleman, looking around the group uncertainly. Despite his size and strength, he had shown little aptitude for tactical thinking during previous exercises. Private Stevens, still nursing a bruised ego from his defeat at Sarah's hands, reluctantly spoke up. "We could try a frontal assault, use our size advantage to overpower their defenses." Sarah shook her head. "That's exactly what they're expecting. Look at the terrain." She pointed to the area surrounding the bunker, which sat on slightly elevated ground with clear fields of fire in every direction. "They have the high ground and good visibility. A frontal assault would be suicide." Johnson frowned, but found himself listening despite his reservations. "What do you suggest?" Sarah studied the landscape with the analytical eye she had developed through years of studying military tactics. "The bunker has excellent fields of fire to the front and sides, but there's a blind spot to the rear where that drainage ditch runs. If we can create a diversion to draw their attention, a small team could approach from behind." "A small team?" Stevens asked skeptically. "How small?" "1 person," Sarah replied calmly. "Someone who can move quietly and isn't easily seen." The implications of her suggestion were clear, and Johnson immediately shook his head. "No way! This is a team exercise. We're supposed to work together." "We will be working together," Sarah explained patiently. "The rest of you create noise and movement from the front to keep them focused in that direction. I'll circle around through the drainage ditch and take them from behind." Coleman looked doubtful. "That's a long way to go alone. What if you get spotted? What if you can't handle all 5 defenders by yourself?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Then we lose the exercise. But if we try a frontal assault against prepared positions, we'll definitely lose. This gives us the best chance of success." The 4 larger recruits exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with relying on someone they still viewed as their weakest member. But they had seen what Sarah was capable of in individual combat, and none of them had come up with a better plan. Finally, Johnson nodded grudgingly. "Okay, we try it your way, but if this fails, it's on you." Sarah accepted the responsibility without hesitation. "Give me 15 minutes to get into position." When you hear my signal, 3 short whistle blasts, start your diversion. Make it loud and obvious. Draw all their attention to the front of the bunker. As the teams separated to prepare, Sarah studied the terrain one more time. The drainage ditch she planned to use for concealment was partially filled with muddy water and ran for nearly 200 yards before approaching the rear of the bunker. It would mean crawling through mud and staying low enough to avoid detection, but it was their best option for victory. At exactly 0800 hours, the exercise began. Sarah immediately broke away from her team and began a wide circle around the battlefield, staying low and using every piece of natural cover available. Her small size, which had been mocked as a weakness, now proved to be a significant advantage in remaining hidden. Meanwhile, Johnson, Stevens, Coleman, and Private Davis began their approach toward the front of the bunker. They moved loudly and obviously, making themselves easy targets, but drawing the defenders' attention exactly as planned. The red team, defending the bunker, included Private Anderson and 4 other recruits. They had spent their preparation time setting up excellent defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. When they spotted Blue Team's frontal approach, they felt confident they could repel any assault. "Here they come," Anderson called out from his position. 4 targets approaching from the southeast. No sign of Martinez. The defenders prepared to engage, focusing all their attention on the approaching threat. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Meanwhile, Sarah had reached the drainage ditch and begun her careful approach toward the rear of the bunker. The muddy water soaked through her uniform, and the close confines of the ditch made movement difficult. But she pressed forward methodically. Every few yards, she paused to listen for sounds that might indicate she had been detected. Back at the front of the bunker, Johnson and his team had taken cover behind a low ridge and were exchanging paint rounds with the defenders. The engagement was exactly what it appeared to be, a distraction. The larger recruits were deliberately aiming high and moving obviously, making themselves easy targets while keeping the red team focused on the frontal assault. "They're pinned down," Anderson reported confidently. "Maintain your positions and keep them suppressed. This is going exactly as we planned." What the defenders didn't realize was that their plan was working perfectly for the opposing team as well. While they concentrated on the obvious threat in front of them, Sarah had covered more than half the distance to their position and was now within striking range. Sarah paused at the edge of the drainage ditch and carefully observed the rear of the bunker. Just as she had hoped, it was completely unguarded. All 5 defenders were focused on the firefight at the front of their position, their backs turned to the direction of her approach. Taking a deep breath, Sarah gave 3 sharp whistle blasts, the signal for her team to intensify their diversion. Immediately, Johnson and his teammates increased their rate of fire and began shouting tactical commands loudly enough for the defenders to hear. Using the noise as cover, Sarah slipped out of the drainage ditch and began her final approach. Her years of martial arts training had taught her to move with incredible stealth, placing each foot carefully to avoid making sound. Within 2 minutes, she had covered the remaining distance and was directly behind the defensive position. The first defender never knew what hit him. Sarah approached Private Wilson from behind and eliminated him with a single precise shot to the center of his back. Before he could call out a warning, she had already moved on to her next target. Private Murphy was the second to fall, taken out as he focused intently on the firefight to his front. Sarah's training round caught him squarely between the shoulder blades, and his sensor immediately registered the hit. The third defender, Private Lewis, finally realized something was wrong when he heard Murphy's sensor alarm going off behind him. He began to turn around just as Sarah's paint round caught him in the side of the head. "Contact rear," Anderson finally shouted, realizing that half his team had been eliminated in less than 30 seconds. "Martinez is behind us!" But by the time Anderson and his remaining teammate, Private Brooks, could turn to engage their new threat, Sarah had already taken cover behind the bunker's defensive positions. Now she was using their own fortifications against them. Anderson tried to coordinate a response, but he found himself caught between two threats. Johnson's team was still applying pressure from the front, and Sarah was systematically eliminating his defenders from behind. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, he left his covered position and charged directly at Sarah. This was exactly the kind of mistake Sarah had been waiting for. As Anderson approached, she calmly stepped out of cover and eliminated him with a single well-placed shot. His momentum carried him past her, and he crashed to the ground, his sensor indicating he had been eliminated. Brooks, the last defender, found himself alone against 5 opponents. Realizing the situation was hopeless, he attempted to surrender. But the exercise rules required him to fight until eliminated. Sarah approached his position carefully and eliminated him with a final shot, securing complete victory for Blue Team. The entire engagement had taken less than 10 minutes. Williams and several other drill instructors had observed the exercise from a nearby hilltop, and they jogged down to the bunker to debrief the recruits. "Outstanding work, Blue Team," Williams announced, though his attention was focused entirely on Sarah. "Martinez, explain your tactical approach." Sarah provided a detailed analysis of her strategy, explaining how she had used the terrain to remain hidden, how her team had coordinated the diversion, and how she had systematically eliminated the defenders by attacking their weakest point. Williams nodded approvingly. "And Red Team, what was your tactical error?" Anderson, still covered in mud from his fall, answered reluctantly. "We focused all our attention on the obvious threat and left our rear undefended. We assumed the entire enemy force was in front of us." "Correct," Williams confirmed. "In real combat, that assumption would have gotten your entire unit killed. Martinez identified your weakness and exploited it perfectly." As the recruits gathered their gear and prepared to return to base, Williams pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived here, I thought you were a mistake. Someone who had slipped through the recruitment process and would wash out within days." Sarah remained at attention, unsure how to respond to this unexpected admission. "Instead," Williams continued, "you have demonstrated tactical thinking, physical skills, and leadership qualities that exceed most recruits I've trained. You took down 5 Marines in individual combat, and today you single-handedly secured victory in a complex tactical scenario." He paused and looked at her with genuine respect. "Tomorrow, you will graduate and earn the title of United States Marine. You have more than earned that honor." As Sarah walked back to the barracks with her teammates, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had faced mockery, dismissal, and constant challenges to prove her worth. People had judged her based on her size and assumed she was too weak for military service. But Sarah had understood something that her critics had missed. True strength didn't come from muscles or size. It came from preparation, determination, and the willingness to never give up no matter how impossible the odds seemed. She had spent years preparing for this moment, training her body and mind to overcome every obstacle put in front of her. The next morning, Sarah Martinez stood with 17 other recruits as they received their Eagle, Globe, and Anchor insignia. She was now officially a United States Marine, having proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is the one nobody sees coming. Years later, when drill instructors told the story of the recruit who was branded Feeble during drills but struck down 5 Marines in a single exercise, they would always end with the same lesson. Never underestimate your opponent based on their appearance, because the deadliest warriors often come in the smallest packages.